be true, chat. You know we be into the historical, rhetorical, constructual, proportional, historical stuff. Hey, you know we like the videos. We like them niche videos, bro. Them niche videos, bro. Niche videos, bro. Historical myths that turned out to be true. Let's get into it.
Viking soul swords.
Who we talking about? We talking about like Medusa and junk?
You to believe. We all know that defeating your enemies with a sword will not inherently make your sword stronger. Or will it? Hey, bro sauce. Brody here. And in today's video, we're discussing
what's good,
soul
bro?
swords. Okay, fake beard and glasses aside, let's discuss what's going on here. For starters, the term soul swords is not historic or scientific. It's just a word I'm using to describe the phenomenon at play. Regardless, back in the early Iron Age in Scandinavia, right before the age of the Vikings, Scandinavian warriors had one big issue. Their weapons sucked, specifically the iron ones. And the biggest reason for that was because during this early iron era, a majority of the iron collected by the Scandinavians was bog iron. Bog iron is formed by bacteria in bogs that is oxidizing trace amounts of iron to gain energy. And in doing so, it would naturally concentrate the iron. And this concentration would actually allow it to be collected and then later smithed. Now, for me, this is super interesting because I had no idea that there was an organic way of farming iron without mining it. But for the Scandinavians, it wasn't so interesting or even beneficial. And that's because while bog iron was convenient, it was not strong. Bog iron, unsurprisingly, is very impure, and for that reason, soft when forged, meaning that the Scandinavians definitely had a disadvantage in battle. And the Scandinavians definitely weren't strangers to battle, but that's a different story. Now, the Scandinavians knew that there was a serious issue with their metal, but they didn't have a solution until they realized that they were not using one of their most plentiful resources, the body of their enemies. And that's not a joke. Scandinavian blacksmiths theorized that potentially incorporating the bones of their dead enemies, or any dead person for that matter, could potentially transfer the spirit of that dead individual into that blade, causing it to be stronger and more durable. And this is where things get a bit interesting, because during this Scandinavian Viking time, they very much so believed that this process was in fact strengthening their swords. However, as history went on, there was a large gap of time between then and now where people simply believed that this was more of a folktale or potentially symbolic, and not really any true benefit to the sword.
Like they thought that it was stronger, so it became
it was actually discovered that no, the Vikings were onto something, although not in the way that they intended. You see, while the Scandinavians and Vikings were using the bones of their enemies, ancestors, and animals to spiritually fuse them to their swords to increase its power, in reality, what they were doing was actually creating a rudimentary form of steel. And the reason for this is because the bones that they were using contained carbon. Like all organic matter, carbon is present, and bones are no exception for that rule, which is why when bones were introduced into the forging process of these swords and weapons, the bog iron was literally being turned into an organic alloy due to this introduction of bones, which in a morbid way is kind of badass. But yeah, I wanted to put this entry first because I thought the timeline was so funny.
Yo, these niggas are one of the first creators of stone, bruh.
Vikings had a very spiritual connection to their weapons, and for that reason, they literally wanted to infuse spirits and souls into them to increase their power. And while to them it was the souls that were adding the power, in reality it was the bones. But what's even more interesting is that down the line, when this practice was theorized and discovered, it was believed by historians and scientists that this was more or less symbolic and spiritual and had no real-world utility. And for that reason, the myth of these bones making the sword stronger was, well, a myth. That was until those same people took a closer look at the swords and realized that, wait, there's not a soul in the sword, but there is early steel. Like, I can only imagine being a scientist or historian in that room, looking at the sword and being like, oh, that's cute, look at them. They put bones on it because they thought it would be like, you know, soul-bound or something. That's funny. Oh my god, they made steel. And the myth of this bone forging process being beneficial was quickly realized to be fact, albeit in a roundabout way. But we're just getting started, so let's move on. Okay, really quickly, I want to mention today's video sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is bro.
Shout out War Thunder, bro. Hey, check them out, chat. Check them out. War Thunder, War Thunder, War Thunder, War Thunder.
New bonus.
War Thunder, War Thunder, War Thunder.
There's honestly most prevalent was the fact to discuss when you're talking about gladiators. But when it comes to historical myths, one of the most prevalent was the fact, or myth, that they never actually fought animals. The whole gladiatorial games.
Everybody knows they fought animals, bro. That's how they started off.
There was so much variety in the types of games that were happening. Some more unfair than others. And some didn't even involve gladiators in the first place. For example, in the Roman Colosseum, it wasn't necessarily uncommon for criminals to be subject not to death, but to a fight in the Colosseum against another criminal to the death. Meaning that while it wasn't a death sentence, there was a likely chance that you would die. On top of this ancient version of bum fights, there was also literal naval battles that would take place in the Colosseum. Yeah, they would literally flood the place and have boats
naval battles is crazy.
And in other cases, they would have a criminal not fight another criminal but fight a professional gladiator, which in that case was definitely a death sentence. And as we all know, gladiators also fought gladiators. But as some of you might not know, gladiators didn't always fight to the death. And it's been proven historically that professional gladiators were of high value to their investors. And while the fights were brutal, typically gladiatorial battles only had a 10 to 20% fatality rate, which is still insane, but that statistic is more like the now modern day knockout rate in the UFC, likely the modern day equivalent of the Roman Colosseum.
I ain't gonna lie, that means
this is where things take.
Hey bro, if I was to be a gladiator and fight, bro, and I'm on my 9th fight, it's a 10% chance of death. I am not taking that 10th fight, bro. Hey, give me my money. I'm escaping, bro. I'm running away. Gladiator, bro, I already gave you 9 hard fought battles, bro. I'm already wounded, already been stabbed, bones broken. I'm already fighting with broken bones, bro. It's a 10% chance. And like, by that time, I probably figured out a little bit of math, right? To realize not percent, but like 10 times the chance. Goodbye. I'm going. See ya. GG.
Because while all of the different types of battles that happened in the Colosseum were historically provable through artifacts,
ain't no way that
and records,
Colosseum was that big to where they was
battle
having
that was
boats
not
and shit in there, bro.
Until recently, and that was battles of gladiators fighting tigers. Now, this is interesting because there has long been records and specifically artworks found of gladiators depicted fighting big cats, specifically lions or tigers. But interestingly, there was never any historical evidence found of these matches actually happening, which is why, for that reason, it was theorized that these artworks were more or less symbolic, showing the strength and the fearlessness of these gladiators, rather than them actually fighting lions and tigers, because, well, how would you even do that in the first place? But when you remember that you're discussing people that literally fit boats into the Colosseum, it's not hard to imagine
how you get a boat in
there,
tigers involved as well. Shit, bro?
Although, I guess that thought wasn't in the mind of historians and archaeologists at the time, because while I'm sure they thought it was possible, they had no evidence to back up this claim. That was until recently. And when I say recently, like I mean recently. The first article published proving the existence of human bones with animal bite marks in the Colosseum was published in 2025.
Damn.
Although in this article, it is stated that these bones were collected in the early 2000s. Unsurprisingly, the publishing of this article was significant because for the first time ever, we had genuine proof of animals fighting gladiators in the Colosseum, which is kind of surprising considering how much art there was depicting it. But I guess if this was so rare and so special back then, it's not hard to imagine why there would be so much art about it because, well, it was significant. Just think about it in a modern context. Nobody takes pictures of regular stuff. You only take pictures of important or significant things.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
that
for
makes
the longest
sense.
time, it was believed that while gladiators and the whole gladiatorial games in the Colosseum were interesting and, well, diverse, up until very recently, there was no proof that they were fighting lions or any big animals. That was until last year when it was proven, because they found a skeleton of a likely 20-year-old man with a tooth mark in his skull and pelvis. And this tooth mark, according to archaeologists, is unmistakably the tooth mark of either a tiger or a lion. Once again, making a historic myth actually fact. The mythical gorilla. If I were to describe a mythical creature to you that was tall, hairy, muscular, and had big teeth, what would you assume I was talking about? Maybe Bigfoot? Maybe Sasquatch? Maybe even a woolly mammoth? But what if I were to tell you that the mythical creature I was describing was actually a gorilla? That's right. Up until surprisingly recently, the concept of a gorilla in the Western world was not something of fact, and it was believed that stories of gorillas were folktales, describing some sort of mythical creature. And while gorillas are definitely mythical in their own regard, they themselves also prove that sometimes fact is stranger than fiction. Let me explain. Now, it's important to note that gorillas obviously were known to people who lived around them. Anybody who lived in the area where gorillas were native were not shocked by them existing. They were simply a creature in their habitat. They were neighbors, essentially. Although, in the Western world, gorillas were something that could not even be fathomed, which is, once again, why they were presumed to be mythical rather than potentially something unseen.
So
one of the earliest recorded accounts of somebody from the Western world describing a gorilla come from an English traveler named Andrew Battle. He lived from 1565 to 1614. And his story is, well, interesting to say the least, but that's a topic for another video. During his travels, Andrew ran into a rather interesting creature that he called Pongo. And the mention of this Pongo creature is, as I stated, one of the first ever recorded mentions of the existence of the gorilla. This is an actual quote from Andrew Battle describing the Pongo creature. This Pongo is in all proportion like a man, but he is more like a giant in stature than a man, for he is tall and hath a man's face, hollowed eyes, and long hair upon his brows. His face and ears are without hair, and his hands also. His body is full of hair, but not thick, and it is a Danish color. He goeth a ways upon his legs, and carries his hands clasped on the nape of the neck. When he goeth upon the ground, they go many together, and kill many that trail in the woods. Those Pongo are never taken alive, because they are so strong, that 10 men cannot hold one of them. That description, albeit long, is interesting and relatively detailed. And coming from a, well, potentially reputable source, it's interesting that even this was written off. Although with no point of reference and this guy literally being held in captivity in Africa, it's potentially reasonable to assume he either hallucinated something or saw something he really didn't, or, well, who knows? Regardless, this account from the early 1600s was the first and really last for a very long time. Which brings us all the way to the 1800s. That's right, over 200 years of gorillas being, well, misunderstood and assumed to be mythology. That was until physician and naturalist Thomas Savage obtained several gorilla bones, including skulls. And with these new discoveries, he wrote his first formal description of this newly discovered animal known as a gorilla. Now, Thomas Savage was actually a wealthy physician from America. He went to Yale Medical School and received his degree in 1833. And interestingly, in 1836,
Hey, bro,
he
school
even
back then
became
had
a
to be
priest as
easy,
well.
bro.
So this man was busy. And because this man was both a priest and a doctor, he was sent as a medical missionary to Africa, specifically Liberia. And it was during his time in Liberia where he was able to acquire the skull and bones of the species that at the time was unknown. That was until he gave it the name that is, well, now famous. Now, the story doesn't end there because we still don't know everything about it. And there is still no, well, visitation of gorillas from experts. Although I do use that term a bit lightly. Introducing Paul de Chaillu. And he was a French-American traveler and zoologist. And he is famous for being the first Westerner to confirm the existence of gorillas. Paul, similar to Thomas, spent time in Africa, although Paul spent time in Africa slightly after Thomas, and what he did was vastly different. Because Paul was not collecting bones in Africa, he was actively killing and sending gorilla bodies back to Europe, and was also actively trying to capture baby gorillas, although unsuccessfully. Paul wasn't doing this out of the goodness for his heart, however, and he was actively selling gorilla bodies to the Natural History Museum in London, where all world...
I just pressed Cast Nasty? What do you mean you just pressed Cast Nasty, bro? You didn't press Cast Nasty, bro. Send the clipper, it didn't happen. I did. What did you press him on? Twitch or YouTube? Bro, this happened like 15 minutes ago. Brother, if you're... Yo, he's like one of the guys that freaking waits to upload the VODs, bro. Or has he been streaming for 21 hours? He's been streaming for 30 minutes.
(14 a.m.) Operators move Maduro and Celia Flores toward the stairwell. They reach the roof. A Chinook hovers.
What'd you say, bro? All right, back to the...
artifacts seem to end up, apparently. And as I mentioned, he actively tried to capture many baby
There ain't
infant
no way
gorillas,
somebody's out
but
there
said that they were
hunting
too,
gorillas,
quote,
bro.
ill-tempered, and they all died within his captivity. On top of this, Paul also sold cannibal skulls found from native tribes in Africa to Europeans as well, which seems less about science and more about money, but that's beyond the point. Regardless, it wasn't until the 1860s that it was proven as a fact that gorillas were actual creatures and not mythical creatures just made up by African tribes, which is a bit ironic considering they literally had European travelers who described seeing these creatures as well, but, well, we'll ignore that. But yeah, up until the 1860s, most Europeans likely have never even heard of a gorilla, and if they did, they assumed it was just some sort of outlandish creature. That was until somebody decided to go, kill them, and send them home for money. But at least with that, we did have the European discovery of the gorilla, proving this myth to be fact. But in case that wasn't interesting enough, check this out. At least in a European context, the discovery of dinosaurs just slightly predates the discovery of gorillas, which if you think about it is insane. Because how do you discover something that lived millions of years before your time, before you discover something that is actively walking the earth and you are actively being told about from native tribes in Africa? Now that I think about it, this entire section kind of makes me feel like European travelers didn't really respect the locals. But what do I know? The golden sheepskin. Greek mythology undoubtedly has some of the coolest imagery and lore when it comes to, well, mythology. However, not all of this mythology is all myth, and some of it actually has genuine roots in history. One notable story from Greek mythology describes something known as the Golden Fleece. It is a legendary artifact that essentially came from a divine flying golden ram, and this ram was essentially a symbol of divine favor and kingship. Now, within the story of the Golden Fleece, there is a man named Jason. He was on a quest to claim his rightful throne, and in this pursuit, he made it his mission to retrieve this Golden Fleece of this mythic, mysterious, and, well, divine ram. And long story short, not to spoil it, but he slays the impossible-to-slay dragon and retrieves the Golden Fleece. The story is obviously more detailed than that, but I'm just giving a trust-me-bro summary. Now, let's separate fact from fiction. In this story, Jason travels to a city called Colchis, which is in modern-day Georgia, which is a relevant fact. And while Jason may have never existed, and while the whole golden ram may have also never existed, and I can pretty confidently say there probably wasn't a dragon around either, there is one thing that is very likely a real artifact, that being the Golden Fleece. And the reason I say this is because in Georgia specifically, Specifically, the location where the story took place, it is not uncommon for gold deposits to wash downstream from mountains in certain waterways. But of course, that's not all. On top of gold literally just washing down the river, there is evidence to suggest that farmers at the time who lived in these regions would use sheepskins from their animals to collect these gold nuggets heading downstream, doing essentially an early version of gold prospecting. But this is where things get interesting, because although people are still doing this in modern-day Georgia, it is believed that this tradition has been passed down through thousands of years, meaning that it is more likely than not that during the time of the story of the Great Fleece, people were using sheepskins to collect gold, literally creating their own golden fleece, leading some historians and experts to believe that this practice and this artifact wasn't just pure myth and actually had a strong basis in, well, reality. And while this artifact alone may be the only piece of fact from the mythology, it's still interesting to see that even some of the largest mythological stories still have a kernel of truth. And it's also cool to kind of imagine the first person who saw, a sheep pelt drying out with some gold on it to be so inspired that they write some crazy lore around it. This is kind of the equivalent of somebody just seeing a stick poking out of the ground and then writing Star Wars.
Stick, bro.
The Puukai. If you thought the United States had the biggest, strongest, and freest eagles, you would be sorely mistaken, because New Zealand actually takes that record. The Puukai is a mythological creature, and it's referred to as a monstrous bird in Maori mythology. The Maori people are believed to be some of the first people to have ever settled in New Zealand, and their history in New Zealand is vast and runs deep. And an interesting part of their story in New Zealand is their mythology, specifically the Puukai. You see, in Maori mythology, the Puukai is a bird that is so massive and so strong that it could pick up and kill a man with ease. And for that reason, this was a mythological creature that was terrifying, and definitely not something to mess with. It was typically seen or used as a cautionary tale, but also sometimes as a symbol of strength. It is believed that the Maori people arrived in New Zealand sometime around the 1400s. And from the 1400s to the mid-1700s, the Maori people remained uncontacted in New Zealand, until they gained contact with European travelers in the late 1700s. Prior to the Maori's contact with the Europeans, they did not have a formal writing system, which means that they relied on oral storytelling to have some sort of record of their people's history, which is a big reason why they had so much lore and such cool stories. But obviously, when a majority of your historical records come from oral accounts, you're basically playing a big game of telephone, and it's hard to tell fact from fiction. And such is the case with the Puukai, because for many, the existence of the Puukai seems, well, too crazy to be true, not only to the Europeans, but also to younger Maori generations. Regardless, that didn't stop the Maori people from continuing the traditions and telling the story of the Puukai. But that doesn't mean that they never existed. Enter the Haast eagle. You see, the Haast eagle is an extinct species of eagle that lived specifically in New Zealand at the exact same place where the Maori people lived. Interestingly as well, the Haast eagle is also the largest known eagle to have ever existed. And it's believed that they weighed anywhere from 22 to 40 pounds and preyed almost exclusively on a bird named moa, which is essentially just an extinct 500-pound variant of the modern-day ostrich. It's believed by researchers that the Haast eagle got to the size it did because it had no natural predators and had seemingly an endless amount of prey, allowing it to evolve and grow uninterrupted. That was until some people came to the island of New Zealand, specifically the Maori people. You see, it's believed that the Haast eagle officially went extinct in 1445, and experts say they went extinct because after the Maori people reached the island of New Zealand only years prior, they were able to hunt the Mau bird to extinction. And with the Mau birds being the primary prey of the Haast eagle, it's not hard to understand how the Haast eagle went extinct after its entire food supply was shut off. And this is really where things get interesting, because if you remember, the Puukai, as described by the Maori people, is a large, monstrous bird that could easily pick up and kill a human man. And as we know, the Haast eagle lived in the same place as the Maori people for a short amount of time, as well as the fact that the Haast eagle also preyed on animals that were literally 500 pounds, meaning that if they could take on that flightless bird, they could probably take on a human, or at least a child at that. And considering the fact that the Maori people were literally devastating the Haast eagle's food supply, it's not hard to imagine that the Haast eagles could either be desperate or just straight up mad that these newfound humans in their ecosystem are messing everything up, potentially triggering some Haast eagle attacks, or Puukai attacks. And while for hundreds of years the story of the Puukai may have seemed like mythology to the Maori people and the Europeans they encountered, when the existence of the Haast eagle was discovered in 1871, the dots were slowly connected, and it was eventually revealed that the Puukai was not any sort of mythical creature. It was very much so real, but unfortunately never lived long enough to tell its side of the story. Speaking of telling stories, if you like the way I tell stories and want to see more cool stories every single Friday, feel free to be a bro and subscribe to the channel. We're currently on the road to 2 million subscribers, and like I said, we post cool videos every single Friday. And I guess while I'm shilling, if you're enjoying this video about myths that actually turned out to be true and want to see a part 2, all you need to do is either leave a like on this video or comment part 2 so I know that you guys actually want more of this. But now that you're subscribed and have liked the video, let's move on to the final entry on this list: Ancient Ozone. I would assume, or at least hope, that everybody watching this video now is familiar with the ozone layer. You know, the protective layer that is literally protecting everybody watching this video right now from the harmful radiation of the sun and space. And while the ozone layer is definitely the GOAT of protecting us from harmful space rays, it actually existed in mythology far before it existed in the scientific world. You see, the ozone layer was officially discovered in 1913 by French physicists Charles Fabry and Henry Boyson, and that discovery was significant. But what if I told you that not just 100 years ago, but thousands of years ago, the concept of an ozone layer was already theorized and Fabry and Henry Boyson, and that discovery was significant. But what if I told you that not just 100 years ago, but thousands of years ago, the concept of an ozone layer was already theorized and well established in the world of mythology? Let me explain. Norse mythology, like Greek mythology, like Scandinavian mythology, runs deep. But one interesting part of Norse mythology I wanted to focus in on is known as Svalin. And in Norse mythology, Svalin is literally a legendary shield that stands in front of the earth and the sun. And its sole purpose is to protect the world from overheating. It's believed that the myth of Svalin dates back all the way to the Bronze Age. And interestingly, the word Svalin itself is actually a translation for the word cold or chill, meaning that Svalin was literally a chill guy. Jokes aside, there's not much known about where this mythology actually stemmed from, although it's interesting how, well, accurate it actually was. Now, whether or not this Nordic mythology from the Bronze Age was actually onto something, or it was just, well, sheer coincidence, the similarities are glaring, which is why I wanted to add it for that reason. Because obviously the definition of Svalin is strictly mythical, the concept of what Svalin represents is definitely not myth, and very much so reality. And while it took until 1913 for physicists to discover the ozone layer, for Nordic storytellers, they were able to theorize the ozone layer with no proof before they ever even discovered iron. That's pretty cool. And that's also the end of this video. If you guys enjoyed this video about myths that actually turned out to be true, check out the video on screen right now. It's a video about things that you
video, bro.
niggas
was checking out the analytics at the end of that. Hey, W video, bro. It's crazy, bro. Some of these myths really isn't myths, bro.
The watch cost 45. You a lost cause, yeah, alright.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, how I count it up. I only like girls who won't give a fuck. My last girl, she said I ain't done enough. I can't spend no bread on a tummy tuck. And I think I need some respect now.